Some people in this world are on the front lines of the struggle between good and evil, and some, like us, bear witness. I'm Therese Apel.
And I'm Nicole Crowell. You may have heard us as we worked on stories and series about law enforcement and crime. And it's safe to say we've seen some of the best and worst of human nature.
We decided there's no greater honor than bringing you the stories of the men and women who seek out the monsters, who speak for the victims, and who put the pieces together on some of the biggest Mississippi crime stories of our time. Welcome to Investigation Homicide. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Investigation Homicide. Thank you for joining us this 4th of July week. I am Therese Apel, and I'm here with my co-host, Amanda Johansson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Amanda, what are you doing for the 4th of July this year?
Nothing, probably.
Working?
Probably, yes.
What cops do on the 4th.
That is correct.
Good deal. Well, so we are really excited to bring you the story that we've got going on today. This is another cold case that was decades in the making, and I've got my dear friend, David Ruth. We've known each other through a bunch of iterations of both of our lives, at least since 2010. And that said, David, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, David is the coroner in Rankin County, but you've also been an investigator for the district attorney's office. You've been a Brandon police officer. Tell us a little bit about your career. What brought you here?
Well, I started my career in July of 1984 and just continued on seeking that law enforcement career, and finally found a home at Brandon PD, and I worked there 21 years, 8 years as a patrolman, and then after that I went into investigations. And after leaving Brandon PD, I went to work for the Rankin and Madison County District Attorney's Office. I stayed there for 14 years and ultimately left to assume the full-time role as Rankin County coroner.
And obviously, as a Brandon police officer is when you encountered the story we're going to talk about today, and you kind of carried it with you through your career. And we're talking 30 years of investigations here, because this case took that long, and there were so many twists and turns through the years. So you brought notes, and we appreciate you doing that, because we want to make sure we're as accurate as we can be. Start off, talk about, now you weren't working the night of the rape that kicked this whole thing off, but tell us how you found out about, I believe, had they ever released her name? We call her Jane Doe, right?
No, that was another cold case.
Oh, that was a different one.
Yeah, her name has actually been released, and she's actually interviewed on other podcasts.
Okay, good deal.
So
tell us when you learned about her.
So I was off. I was a patrolman at the time for Brandon PD, and I was on a night off. But when I came back in the next day, of course, things like that just back then never happened in Brandon. Still don't. Brandon's a great little small sleepy town, I call it. But we had learned that a rape had occurred the night before, and everybody was still out looking and just searching for all small details that we could have found to help us solve the rape.
So set the scene for us. She had just moved to town. She was working as a waitress at Western Sizzlin'. Tell us what happened that night.
Right. She was a waitress at the old Western Sizzlin' there at 49 and 80. And she had gotten off the late shift after 11 o'clock, and she had been sitting out in the parking lot talking to a coworker, and ultimately left and came to Brandon where she lived. And she had stopped at a local gas station there close to her home. She went in to get a treat for her children to have for them the next morning. And when she came out, she started to exit the parking lot, and that's when she was encountered by an assailant who had gotten into her van and was hiding in the back of it. And he stuck a knife to her throat and told her to drive and just to not look at him. And she drove and just followed his instructions.
And tell us again, what year was this?
That was in 1990.
Okay. So that is when we were hearing, or around that same time I was in junior high and high school during the 90s, and we were hearing these stories of people that would do that. Of course, it was always supposed to be related to a gang situation or whatever, but you were afraid that somebody was going to get in your car and attack you.
Still till this day, I look in my back seat whenever I get in my car, because I was born in 87, but we were like, that was just taught ever since this happened is you need to be aware that someone could do this. So it's stuck with me, even though I wasn't even aware of the case back then.
And it's crazy because you hear the idea that someone could do this, but there aren't a lot of cases where it actually happened that we know about. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of cases where it happened, but that you hear about. This is the one. And this guy, that was kind of his MO, as we find out. So he tells her to drive, and she's driving. What happens next?
So he did take her to a very secluded spot, a dead-end road, just outside the city limits of Brandon. It's now incorporated in the city, but at the time it was not. And he got her to the back of the van, and he raped her. And then he brings her back to close to the area where she had stopped, where he had gotten into, which we later found out he had parked his car and her truck. And he got out of the van, and he said, "I know where you live, and do not, call anybody." There's the typical threats of harms to your family and stuff of that nature. And the last time she saw him, he was jumping a fence at the old McDonald's where the Taco Bell is sitting now. And there was a couple of old abandoned houses behind there. So we assumed that's where he parked his vehicle. And nothing surfaced after that. It was just a dead-end trail.
Now, you were affected by that story as a police officer, from what I read. That was something that kind of stuck with you through the years. What was it about that really impacted you?
Well, the fact that a woman had been kidnapped and victimized and just was in fearful of her life. She was just caged like an animal and just at his mercy. And it just infuriated me that someone had done that. And you're right. I just couldn't forget it. I wasn't the investigator on it, but, I followed the case and was very curious about how somebody could do that and get away with it. And there was evidence collected at the crime scene that we just felt certain was going to, at the time, tell us who it was. And then it went cold.
So the case goes cold, and you go on with your career, and this is in the back of your mind. You get to the district attorney's office, right? Was that when you brought it back, or was it?
No.
Okay.
No, I was still at Brandon PD. I had gotten out of patrol after 8 years, still thinking about it, and I was in investigation and, working a lot of cases then. And then I just thought one morning about that case. So I went and pulled it out of the file cabinet and just started looking at it again as a fresh set of eyes, just what was missed. And that morning I was going through, and after being an investigator and knowing, chain of custody and evidence and how it worked at the crime lab, I started going through it page by page, seeing what the former investigator had done on it. And I got to a point where I saw where suspect evidence was collected from a vaginal swab. And when I saw that, I immediately knew that there should be results and conclusions to what that yielded. So I started searching for that and couldn't find it. And I realized at that time that there was never an answer to whose suspect DNA that was. So I contacted the state crime lab and talked to Deidre Hughes, and she was over the DNA section at the time, or working in there. She's now the chief person over that. And I just asked her about a case number, and she said, "Ruth, you realize that's 14 years old." Mm-hmm. It was actually 2004 when I opened it back up and realized that the suspect DNA had never been tested. And I said, I asked her, "What's the chance of that DNA evidence still being at the crime lab?" And she laughed. She says, "You got to be kidding me." If anybody knew about how the crime lab worked, anytime incoming evidence come in, there was a lady out there went straight to the vault and got all the evidence that was ready to go out just to keep room. And if you took something in, you certainly was going to take something out just to make room for the other stuff. And I said, "Please just go look." She called me back probably an hour or so later, and she said, "You're not going to believe this." And my heart just skipped a beat. And I didn't think that she was going to say it's not there, because when she said that, I had the hopes, and she said, it is still here 14 years later.
That's God.
Yeah. And I said, this case is meant to be solved. And I said, what happened? And she just simply said that DNA wasn't really that big a thing back then, and a lot of people wasn't using it. It was costly at the time. And she said that the request was not sent in to have it tested. And I asked her, could it still be tested? And she said, absolutely, if you send me the request. So 30 minutes later, she had that. She tested it, and she contacted me sometime later, and she says, well, we've got a full DNA profile on the suspect's semen. And so I immediately was expecting a reverse hit, back hit, where people are put into the system. If they go into jail, their DNA is collected and stuff of that nature. And I was just hoping, it's kind of like fingerprints. They break into a car today, but they were arrested 3 years ago for something else, and their fingerprints match. So I was just really hopeful. I just thought, we've got this guy. And no hit came out. And I was just disheartened. I even contacted Ms. Hughes several times later, and I was just like, are you sure it's in there? This is not the only rape that this guy did. Typically, they may rape one time and say, hey, this is not my thing, but typically when a rapist is a rapist, and then they continue, and you never know how many victims that are out there.
Amanda, you work sex crimes sometimes, and that is obviously something that you're familiar with. What are you thinking as far as, that aha moment when they call back and they say, well, obviously they didn't say we got a DNA hit, but just knowing, wow, okay, so we can move on to the next step in this investigation.
Yeah, like David said, it gives you hope, knowing that, okay, this investigation is not over. The previous investigators did what they were supposed to do according to their abilities at that point in time. And like you said, that DNA just wasn't really known about then, and it was expensive. And so to have the agency at the point that you've opened it back up be like, yeah, go ahead, we'll pay to get it tested, is astounding. And I know that we'll talk about Bubba Branlett and his willingness to foot the bill for things in the future. But it gives you hope that law enforcement is progressing and that they truly care about these victims and they want to solve the crimes.
So here we are. Once again, like, we've taken it as far as we can. What happens next? Now that okay, there's no hit in there, but I know this MO is not one of somebody that hasn't done this before or won't do it again.
That's right. Actually, MBI had a cold case unit that they were, just retired troopers that really still had the know-how to get things checked out and done and look for things. And they had heard about an individual in Missouri that had written a statement and confessed to the Brandon rape. I had no knowledge of that at the time. The former investigator had, Brandon investigator had, and actually had gone and talked to him and had gotten a saliva sample from him. But prior to the DNA thing, the serology didn't match anything.
So let me interject here and say, if you listen to or watch Investigation Homicide, we have heard this guy's name before. This suspect that we're about to talk about. David, who was it?
Reuben Weeks.
And who's Reuben Weeks?
Reuben Weeks was an individual that was in jail in Missouri, and he had heard about the Brandon rape, and he confessed to it. And we got a statement from him, and I read the statement, and I immediately knew from his statement that he was not the suspect that I was looking for. He had major inconsistencies in his written statement. Places that he took the victim, it didn't match any of it.
Now, interestingly, Reuben Weeks he was recently arrested in the almost 40-year-old cold case rape and murder of Shondra May. and he was serving time in Missouri for a very similar case to that, where he had raped a girl and bound her, and it was a very similar case to the Shondra May case. So the fact that he had, confessed to this at some point, it sounded like a really good lead, even though the serology didn't match, or did it?
It did not match, but if you ever heard the old saying, be careful what you ask for. Reuben Weeks actually wanted to prove his guilt in the Brandon rape, so he asked that his DNA be taken. So his DNA was taken and it was submitted. It excluded him from the Brandon rape, but absolutely convicted him of the Missouri rape. It matched the rape in Missouri, but did not match the rape in Brandon. So I knew again that Reuben Weeks was not my person. He's a bad person. He victimized women, but he did not victimize my person.
Well, and let me just ask this question, because this popped in my head when you said that. Do we think that he did that to something to somebody else and thought that this was the same victim, or was he just inserting himself in the investigation?
Well, the story that I never could confirm was that he was trying to confess to crimes down here because his family lived here, and that he was just trying to get to prison back in Mississippi.
Gotcha.
So,
but he never did confess to the Shondra May case, which was the crime that he committed down here.
Right. I never talked to him about that because I didn't have enough knowledge about the Shondra May case to, it wasn't my case.
Sure, it was over in
everybody
Scott
knew
County.
about it. It was, that was a case to be solved. And every time something come up, every sexual assault incident we had, people would call in, he did Shondra May, he's the one that killed Shondra May. Yeah. So we just felt like if enough people would keep coming forward and keep that alive, and speak for Shondra. And that's what we try to do we try to speak for the victims, and that was my biggest thing in the investigations. I just strived on always trying to catch those who thought they couldn't be caught.
Right.
And that's just the satisfaction that just keeps us going day after day.
Right. Well, and was it disappointing when you were finally I know you had questions throughout, but when you could finally rule out Reuben Weeks, what was that like?
Well, it was a relief that he was ruled out. I was hoping it was him because that case would have been over. But when I realized it wasn't him, then that took me to another dead end, and the case went cold again. Until 2017, that was a long time. And I remember getting a call from, at the time, Detective Bo Edgington from Brandon PD.
Yeah.
And he said, we got a hit on your DNA case on the rape in Brandon in Memphis. And I said, I'm on my way to Memphis.
Yeah.
And he said, wait a minute. And he told me that this rape occurred 1 month to the day of the Brandon rape. And I didn't understand why it had been that long. Found out that the state of Tennessee and Memphis had over 2,000 sexual assault cases that were unworked.
I remember that being
because
a
of
major
budget
thing.
fundings.
Yeah.
And they just didn't have the funds to work everything. They got a grant, and they went to work on them. And I don't know how many's been completed now, but that turned out to be, a rape up there. And we looked at that, and it was the same MO as the one in Brandon, with the exception of the victim in Memphis didn't really comply with him. He had gotten her back. He had raped her, and he was taking her back to an area. And eventually he got out, put her out of the vehicle. And she was nude from the waist down on the interstate, and he had cut her really bad, had disfigured her face, and so a truck driver pulled over, and saw what was going on and took her to a hospital, the same hospital she actually worked at.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so just thank God that she survived it. But then we knew right there that we had a rapist out there that we knew that had raped at least 2. I know he raped many, many more, but I knew we had him on 2 rapes because of the DNA on the scenes.
I want to make sure that I understand the timeline. So you said that in 1984, our Brandon victim was raped, and then 1990. I'm sorry, 1990, and then 1 month to the day in 1990, our suspect raped another victim in Memphis. Is that correct?
August 12th,
Okay.
1990, he raped
Okay.
a lady in Brandon. September 12th, 1990, he raped a lady.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then in 2017, they submitted the DNA, or they started investigating the Memphis case, and that's when you got notified of the DNA match.
Well, in 2004 is when, 14 years later is when I got the DNA uploaded.
Right.
Right. So then in 2017 is when Memphis got caught up.
got on board.
And then that's when they hit the back hit that I was talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that connected it to my rape.
So tell me what that feels like. As a reporter, it's different. I mean, it's like I have those cases that I will follow until the very day I die. And then I'll probably haunt the people that aren't investigating them after that. I know that sometimes when something comes back, it's like there's this almost a spiritual experience. Sometimes it feels like, what was that like for you to get that call from Bo that said, hey, we know who the guy is?
Oh, it was amazing. And it was just the hope and the blessings that I had been looking for. And I mean, my heart was racing. And I told him, I'm on my way. I was just ready to go out of the DA's office. I had left Brandon PD and went to the DA's office. And I was ready to just walk out of my office, get in my truck, and drive to Memphis. And but then I found out that the detective it was working at had since retired. And, we actually talked to him, and he remembered it just like we did. But, you're talking about a case sticking with you and you want to follow it to the end. I actually made a copy of the case, everything that was in that, and put it in a file folder. And when I left Brandon PD in 2008, I took that case with me to the district attorney's office. I worked there for 14 years as an investigator. And I had that on my desk, and every day I walked in, I would see her name. And that just, and and a couple of times I thought, I'm still working. I'm still gonna look, and we feel, that we love to catch them before they die, and oftentimes they're never found.
So obviously I'm getting emotional, and it's because my dad was a district attorney. He died in November, as you know, because you were there. But I just spoke with one of his investigators today. We were just texting this morning, and there's a real special place in my heart for those guys. And I was just thinking when you were talking, did she know through all those years that you were looking out for her?
She did not. She didn't know who I was.
Wow.
And I found out later that when Ryan and Catherine Newman and our victims impact coordinator went to discuss the case with her, Leslie, they told her about this. And, they called first and set up a meeting, and she had her family there. And so she's like, I don't understand. She said, the guy that raped me is in jail. She heard that Reuben Weeks had confessed, and she thought it was Reuben Weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So she was really confused at the time. And, you don't think there's anything comical about any of this, but Ryan and Catherine and Leslie flew to Georgia and was going to rent a car and go over to, the state that she lived in, pretty close there. Mm-hmm. When they got there, there were no rental cars.
Oh, wow.
The only thing that they really had to offer was a U-Haul truck. And we have photographs. I don't know if you've seen those of Ryan and Leslie and Catherine standing beside a U-Haul truck.
Nice.
And they piled up in the middle of that thing and took off to the victim. And that's when she found out about me and that I had been working the case ever since. And she and I have since talked and, made a connection, as well as the victim in Memphis. And we still interact on Facebook, Messenger.
Good.
To this day. Every time I hear from, her name was Benji. That was her little nickname at the Western Sizzling.
Uh-huh.
But every time I see Benji will call me, occasionally, and I'll call her and check on her. But every time we text, I will ask her, I said, how's my hero doing? And she says, you're my hero. But that's the satisfaction that you get.
Absolutely.
And not to mention the major satisfaction is to know that Daniel Ray Skaggs was captured.
I was going to say, now introduce us to Daniel Ray Skaggs.
Right. So Ryan Berry is the assistant district attorney for Rankin. He's in the Rankin office, Madison, Rankin County. When Ryan started there, I was already there. And after I had worked another cold case that was solved by DNA after 45 years, this was not as long. And so I went to him and I started talking to him about it. And he said, well, I really don't know. That's expensive. And, but Ryan, I didn't realize he was looking into it in the depth that he was, but he did. And he come to me one day and he said, let's sit down and talk about this. So I sat down and gave him everything, because I still had a copy of the file. And I sat down and gave him everything. And he went to the district attorney and said, hey, I'd like to follow this case. There's some really good stuff here. Now that we got two people connected to the same DNA. And so district attorney, Bubba Bramlett, said, work it. He said, it's expensive. He said, I don't care. Work it. Mm-hmm. And so Ryan contacted a company called Bodie Technology, and who does a lot of the DNA testing and genealogical stuff, the family trees and all that. And so they put an interest into it, and they said, I believe this is something that we can work. So I got the evidence to Bodie Technology, and they started their work. And it took several months, but eventually Bodie Technology contacted Ryan and said, hey, we've got a Y chromosome match of 3 brothers. And the Y chromosome in the DNA goes to the male side of the family. Right. So it could be anybody on the male side, father, uncle, brother, as long as they're on that side. And we found out that one of the brothers had passed away. So I immediately had a sinking feeling that was my guy.
Right.
And so I asked Ryan, I said, have y'all done criminal history backgrounds on them? And they were working on that at the time. And Ryan called me and he said, well, we got a criminal history background on one of them, and he served time in the state of Texas for rape. And
Bingo.
I said, there's our guy. And I said, please tell me he's still alive. He said he is. And he was identified as Daniel Ray Skaggs.
So obviously, just like you were ready to jump in the car to go to Memphis, were you fixing to just go round him up yourself?
I wanted to go so badly and just hunt him down and hunt him like he hunted his victims.
Yes.
I wanted to be there when he was captured, because he started raping women in 1977 in the state of Texas. And I believe it was at least 6 that he was known to have raped over there. And he stayed in prison over there until 1986. So he gets paroled in 86, and he's paroled back to the state of Georgia. And I believe he went to Arkansas, and then he moved to Georgia. And but in 4 years after he got out of jail, we know that he raped Benji and Brandon because of the DNA. There's no telling how many people he raped between 86 and 1990.
Well, and it's kind of a testament to how important it is that we have DNA technology, because clearly in Texas, they caught him on the merit of the investigation without the DNA. But what if we would have had it? Then, that would have, it may have stopped him before Benji even.
Correct. Well, I just can't imagine 6 rapes while you would only serve that small amount of time in prison. But, things happen.
Well, and I was wondering too, do we ever consider, one of the things I'm thinking of is how lucky these 2 victims that we're talking about are, because it would seem that if you've raped and you've gotten caught for it, some people escalate to, I'm not going back to jail, but I'm not going to quit raping either.
Right.
And they'll kill the victim.
Exactly. And I knew then, so 6 rapes in Texas, 2 rapes in Mississippi, which it went a little farther. We found out that he attempted to rape a woman in Georgia. And a state trooper over there suspected something suspicious about a vehicle. He turns around on it and attempts to pull it over, and they slow down enough. And Daniel Ray Skaggs, we found out later, was driving the van, and a female victim jumps out of the van, got out somehow, and she was nude, and all she could say, she was of German accent, she was from Germany, and all she could get across to the trooper was knife. And so he puts her in the car, and they ended up in this small pursuit and finally got Daniel Ray Skaggs, and he was in jail over there. But when it come time for court, the victim had fled back to Germany, and they had no victim to testify, so he was released.
Wow. So what happens next? You know who it is. You know who you're going for. Do you know where he is at this time?
Well, once we narrowed it down on the Y chromosome and found out where he lived, we contacted the state of Georgia, and there was a detective up there named Josh Dean. Found out Josh was a lot like me. If he got after it, he didn't like to stop. And Josh actually set up surveillance in a wooded area watching Daniel Ray Skaggs, and actually had done on Valentine's Day. I remember this. It was February 14th. On Valentine's Day of 23, I believe was, that he actually did a trash collection that was discarded out on the street in hopes of doing touch DNA. So he was able to get certain items out of there. Touch DNA was secured and collected and secured and then tested, and it matched the DNA profiles on my rape and the Tennessee rape.
And that's what you
And
need
I'll
right
come
there.
back to Daniel Ray Skaggs.
So at this point, obviously, each of these steps have to feel like a little victory, but when you've got that definite DNA, it definitely matches. You've got eyes on him. What's going through your mind?
Well, you think that's the perfect storm because, everybody nowadays, all the jurors nowadays, as many trials as I've seen and I've been a part of, I hear so many times, well, we didn't convict him because they didn't have DNA. Well, we had DNA 3 times to the same person. So I said, we have the perfect storm. Warrants were issued. Ryan Berry went to Georgia with a Rankin deputy and then met Josh Dean out there. They wanted me to go, but unfortunately I had just had some ankle surgery and I was immobile and I didn't want to hinder anybody, and I just couldn't travel, but I would have loved to have been there for that capture.
Sure.
But I still ended up receiving, Ryan Berry called me one day, and I'll never forget it because I said, well, I guess it's the best birthday present I could ever have, because Daniel Ray Skaggs was arrested on my birthday.
Oh, wow.
And so that just made it worth everything to me. And then after the extradition part was completed in Georgia, he was brought back to Mississippi to stand trial.
Daniel, would you mind putting up that picture of Daniel Ray Skaggs again on the day of his arrest? So you see on the left there, that is him the day that they picked him up, correct? And then on the right is his mugshot from the Rankin County jail. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So you see he's a much different guy there than he was in the younger pictures we showed you earlier. Some people find some compassion when they see somebody that looks like a crippled old man. It doesn't look like a scary rapist that raped for 40 years, possibly. Is there anything to that? Is there any merit in that?
They were actually searching his home looking for trophies, because people like Daniel Ray Skaggs, they'll keep something from a victim that constantly reminds him of what he did. Yeah. I had no compassion of Daniel Ray Skaggs. I was absolutely amazed that he was still alive and in good enough shape like that to stand trial. And so it was a 3-day trial. I think 13 people testified. When I actually got up there and testified, Daniel, something happened in there. They had a medic in the courtroom present in the event of anything. And when I started talking about the actual facts of the case and I was looking at him eye to eye, I don't know if he faked something or if he just had some kind of moment, but we had to recess a little bit and let the medic check him out.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah.
How quickly were y'all able to, like, from the time of arrest to trial, what was that time period in between?
Let me look at the notes here. I know he was arrested on March 14th, and let's see, maybe in this here, he went to trial. It was in June, maybe. No, not. Yeah, he was found guilty on June 19th.
Oh, of the same year.
Same year.
Wow,
yeah, March to June.
That's awesome to
Yeah.
get it pushed forward that fast. I guess when it's a cold case, they're ready to go to trial whenever.
Right.
Well, and how much does, and of course, when I said earlier, what a shame, just in case you were listening and you couldn't see my face, I was being sarcastic. But how much of that was also because he seemed to be in failing health that it moved that fast to trial?
I'm sure that had some to do with it, but that was a case that was 35 years old, and we had all the evidence that we were going to get. So there was nothing else to look for. There was, a lot of times when an arrest is made like that, other victims come forward. A lot of our sexual assault cases, when we would air that this person was arrested, or they see it in the Rankin County News that that person had been arrested for this, we received calls. Detectives received calls. Said, "Look, I never did want to say anything. I was embarrassed, but that person victimized me," and then we would have to look for other evidence to try to add charges to it. We knew in his failing health that we weren't going to be able to, do that. So I honestly can't tell you why it got there so quick, but it did.
But we're glad that it did.
I'm glad.
How long did he last?
Daniel Ray Skaggs was found guilty in June, and just shortly after, in the early weeks of August, so a little over a month, he died in prison. And he, of course, I was the coroner, and my deputy coroner called me, and he's told me that he had died, and he said, "Do you want to go out there?" I wanted to, but then I felt that because I was a part of the prosecution that I should have kept my distance from that, and I did. So I never touched Daniel Ray Skaggs after he passed.
Sure.
But, in these cases, you have two victims. You have the victims and their families, and you have the defendants and their families. The family of Daniel Ray Skaggs didn't do anything.
No, they didn't.
And they're
ask for this.
victimized by his death. But for him to victimize so many women, and we have 8, almost 9, but I guarantee you there were more that he never got caught, because a lot of times small town detectives don't have the funding to have things checked, and a lot of times they don't believe in their victims, because there are a lot of times that people cry rape and they'll cry wolf too many times, and when it actually happens, a lot of times they don't come forward. I've had victims that were ashamed and embarrassed and wouldn't come forward because they didn't want the community to know. But I just encourage every detective out there, if they don't do anything but just, if they've got one cold case, because cold cases, you can work them nowadays, and the DNA's out there, the technology's out there. I always tell people, I joke, is if you don't want to get caught, you better not touch anything. Because if you can go and get someone's trash out of their trash can, and run a touch DNA sample, tell that you was holding a Coke can or a cigarette butt, or, it's just phenomenal. But it's what we need, and I just encourage everybody, just if you got a cold case, open it up, let somebody else look at it, and say, hey, the easiest thing for a person is to say, well, I didn't do anything wrong, or I didn't misspell a word. I've got everything in my report I need, but a fresh set of eyes could say, well, what if you had done this? Mm-hmm. The investigator at the time in Brandon, he did an amazing job in collecting the sexual assault kit. It's just the one little small thing where the suspect DNA was not tested. and that fresh set of eyes is what reopened his case and got it solved.
Well, and not only that, in a small town, sometimes the rate of crime, you're one of just a few detectives. So you send something off to the crime lab and crimes keep happening and you keep investigating. And so at some point you're like, I never did get that back. But, it's kind of the way that works in some of these small towns. So, yes, the fact that this cold case went that long, and then just because, you championed it. You were the one that held on to it through all the years. We might not be telling this story. We wouldn't be telling this story if you hadn't held on to it and remembered it.
Well, there were so many agencies. I feel like I was the smallest part of it. There was Brandon PD, Rankin SO, Georgia State Police, Texas Police. The FBI had a little small part in it, and then Bodie Technology. But Ryan Berry, I feel like Ryan keeps saying, had not been for me, it wouldn't have been solved. I understand me reopening it and finding that small little part, but Ryan Berry had studied this genealogy stuff so much, and he was so knowledgeable on it that he ran with it, and he convinced the DA, and it was pretty costly. But the DA just kept saying, pay it.
And definitely it was worth it in the end.
Yeah, and he does that for his victims. So, we're blessed to have somebody that just say, like Thompson said, we can't afford it, right. But there's funds out there if you just ask for them.
Now, tell me this: you and I have worked since then on other cases that came back because of the same kind of DNA analysis, the genealogy.
Correct, cold case.
Yeah, tell me about how often that helps nowadays.
If you put the work into it, it helps a lot, and the families are just so grateful. My Jane Doe, 45 years of being murdered. There wasn't DNA 45 years ago that we knew of. Mm-hmm. And out of 41 years of law enforcement, that in coroner, I had never in my career ever had a court order issued for a body to be exhumed. We hear all the time, well, this person was poisoned and all that, and then it was not enough. But the Jane Doe case met the criteria in the statute to be exhumed, and Judge Dewey Arthur actually signed that search warrant. Judge Dewey Arthur was actually the same judge on Daniel Ray Skaggs that sentenced him to 2 life sentences.
Yeah.
And but after we got Jane Doe exhumed, we were able to send off remains to Othram Lab in Texas. And Othram has been absolutely wonderful. I think I've got 5 cold cases now solved 4 solved by Othram, and 1 that they're working on right now. Sure. And 45 years after Jane Doe was exhumed and tested, they went to Texas. The sheriff's department went to Texas with the Rankin DA's office, Joey Mays, and went over there and delivered the death notification to her 2 daughters. And they were always told that their mom had just gotten onto a truck with a truck driver and went to New Mexico. Wow. And I told them when they came over and had a proper burial that it wasn't that their mother had abandoned them and left them. She couldn't come home to them. So that's other families that I've inherited. And, the rape in Brandon, Benji, her daughter actually refers to me as Uncle David.
Oh, good.
And we all just have a great relationship.
And that's, I think, something that a lot of people don't always see at the end of these cases is that as horrible as the cases are, there is healing that comes from after all those years saying your mom didn't leave you, or being able to say, you know what, we got the guy that did it.
That's right. And that's the satisfaction for law enforcement, is to know that you didn't give up, you didn't quit, and you kept fighting for that person. And, it's just like in the coroner situation now. When I have a victim, I answer for them. I'm speaking. I have to back up, 2-3 days, a week, a month prior to them dying to see what led them up to that day. And if there's a victim there, and we look for those cases to know that it was, I say there's a fine line between suicide and homicide. And we walk that line, we look at it, and we've actually been successful in calling that. They were ruled suicides, and with my investigation and questioning, found out that it was actually homicides.
Amazing.
So,
Amanda, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just love that, I feel like there was absolutely a reason that you moved from Brandon Police Department to the Rankin DA's office, and that was for you to bring this case with you and be a thorn in the side of everybody who's like, no, we're not going to do that. I've actually worked with Ryan Berry. I've worked with Catherine Newman. They are amazing. And since I've left Rankin County, I've actually called Ryan to ask him a question about a search warrant, because he is so dedicated and knowledgeable. And if he doesn't know, he's going to research it. And so it's such a testament to the group that y'all have built over there in Rankin County, Rankin and Madison County, that everyone brings something to the table. Everyone is a resource. And I think that a lot of other counties could learn from the example that Rankin and Madison set.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You talk about being thorns in the sides. I think the biggest thorn that I was in the side of was Deidre Hughes. Bless her heart. I called her I don't know how many times, and I'm like, are you sure that's in there? Yeah. Can everybody see it? Because I'm like, this guy now has raped 2 people. He hadn't stopped. We got to know who he is. And Deidre just kept assuring me that it was in there. It was in there. But just like you said earlier, this case was meant to be solved 14 years after the rape. And it's just, a fresh set of eyes looking at something, and then the evidence still being out there 14 years later. Because that was a sinking feeling to me, because I know how Miss Bernice Langston, bless her heart, she was on top of it. If you went out there, dropped something off, and if work had been completed, you were taking it back.
Right.
And everybody loved Miss Bernice, and she's since retired. But they did an amazing job. Deidre did good on it. She still does an amazing thing for the crime lab, and she's available for everybody to help.
Great. Well, anything else you'd want us to know about this case that we wouldn't know to ask you about?
No, just the satisfaction of me looking at Daniel Ray Skaggs in that courtroom and hearing the verdict being read. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. And we were sitting there by the victims. And, of course, you can't do any kind of outburst, or Judge Arthur will hold you in contempt and lock you up. But we sat there and we squeezed each other's hands. And so we know that we won. The system prevailed.
I think that's something that I wish I could write better, is for the world that is around the protectors, you guys, law enforcement, and to have that moment where that justice actually worked, and that it actually, like, we've come full circle. The bad guy is taken care of, and there's justice for the victim and their family. I don't think there's a way to convey to people who don't live that what that feels like. But I know that in some cases I've talked to detectives and other law enforcement folks that have said it's up there with the birth of your children sometimes, depending on the case. So, all right, Amanda, any closing thoughts?
No, I just think great job. I hope that this next generation of law enforcement strives to be, what you did for this case in every case that they work.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, David, thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you.
We really appreciated having you, and I'm sure that we will call you back on some of these other cases too.
Yeah.
Guys, thank y'all for watching Investigation Homicide, or for listening if that's what you're doing. If you'd like to sponsor us, we would love for you to be on our podcast. We'd love to talk about you. If you need a podcast, talk to Daniel Anderson at Audio Alchemy. He is our podcast guy, and he makes all this possible, and he can do all kinds of fancy things. So give him a call if that's something you're interested in. Be back with us this same time, same place next week, next Thursday at 5 on Investigation Homicide. Thanks for joining us.